having I haven't especially like the stuff like in the room is gender. Any of the students okay, cool. So quick bit about me. People like to give advice of the I like to do when I it, as opposed probably the five key things. Five key things. Hi everyone. Thank you. So I've spent some time managing 9 software engineers for 12 months with RoboCup. There's meant to be a picture here, but my PDF kind of fell. Share whole screen sharing. I go to Safari. Sorry everyone, I just had a PDF export not go too well on my end. Got some things here. So really quick, there's RoboCup, which is like 9 software engineers. Pictures don't work here. I spent some time in SunSwift for 3 or 4 years, which was managing a team of about 30 or 70 engineers, depending on the time. We tried to build a solar car and drive it across the country. That's where I probably learned the most. There's Perla, which I've been doing for the last 5 years. It's running a startup of about 15 to 20 people. Half of those are engineers, and we're focused on building a consumer-facing web app. So that's more like kind of techie office job. And then there's just what I do on the side a lot of the time, which is teaching, running teams of tutors, teach about, work with about 50 tutors a year. So again, a very different environment there. Now, what we want to talk about first is understanding people generally. Most people intuitively understand other people. You kind of figure this out, whether you've got like partners or best friends or family members or colleagues. You kind of start to figure people out in your head, even if you don't know why or how things work. But probably one of the most straightforward way is to look at people as just across three main dimensions, which is like, you know, who are you as a person that's fairly independent of your environment? Then it's like, you know, what organization are you part of? What's like your general background outside of you? You know, I could take you up and I could go send you over to America and work a different job. And then there's a situation, which is like what's going on right now, right? So if we just like take that as an example of like me standing here, it's like, okay, well, I'm a 29-year-old male who grew up in a smaller town, came to Sydney. That means I generally like nature more than I like city stuff. So I don't really like going out to fancy restaurants. I like going like mountainous areas away from people, for instance. And that's like me. There's like a lot of that, and that kind of will translate in many contexts. And there's like, okay, there's the broader environment I'm around. So it's like, great, well, I'm in Sydney with you all. I'm working at the uni. We're at the uni. This thing kind of persists, but it's not inherent to me. And then there's like the situation, which is like right now. And like this situation will change my behavior. So I've got the part of me that's like me, that dictates my behavior. I've got the broader context I'm in generally these days. And then I've got right now, which means that I'm going to be a little bit more loud today, a little bit more assertive, a little bit more dominant, because, you know, that's just the situation I'm in. So this is a great way to think about people, because, you know, people aren't one-dimensional, right? People have a lot of aspects to them, and it helps you then isolate things. You know, for instance, like I have people, I've always thought this is funny. I have a lot of people who are like, I'll have friends and colleagues that'll tell me simultaneously. Some will be like, I'm the least scary person they know, and some will tell me I'm the scariest person they know, right? Which is like very interesting. It's like, well, how can that exist? Well, I'm still the same person, but the environments in which I work with them or interact with them will be very, very different. For instance, you know, like there was a guy in Sunswift, the solar car thing, called Ravi, and he's a nice kid. And he was a year or two younger than me, and I taught him in a bunch of CSE courses. And then I also ran Sunswift, and he worked under me. And then I think we did something like we went out socially or something, and he just freaked the hell out when I was like, I just didn't give a shit. I was just like hanging out, you know, just having fun. And he's like, I don't understand. Are you sick or something? And that was always really interesting, because he had a certain impression of my behavior, but that was obviously the synthesis of things at various times. And then when it comes to understanding the person, this is from the literature. It's like you can usually also isolate how much of someone is, you know, their knowledge, their abilities, their techniques, and how much of it is like their culture and their values, right? And, you know, we all kind of know this. Like, we operate in a fairly diverse environment. You might know people who are equally competent with programming, but they come from extremely different family or cultural backgrounds. So the ways you interact with them might be different. And, you know, quite often that's conflated with, you know, being janky, and you get those kind of, you know, really cliched examples of like, that's why we like diverse teams, because it always forces us to think about things from different perspectives, right? Because when you work with different people that have different personalities, right? Like in general, like to, you know, you do like a broad brush, it's like if you find like the middle person in, you know, let's just say UNSW, and this is just from my experiences, you go get the super Aussie dudes from the beach, and like they're often like really loud and obnoxious on one end, right? And then you get like the more conservative Indo-Asia cultures, and like they're more kind of careful and quiet and cautious and, you know, respectful on the other end. And like there's not anything necessarily right or wrong about that, but it's like a lot of those people can have the same competencies, but they just have whole different backgrounds, and that's not bad. Sometimes a certain level of agreeableness or disagreeableness or risk taking or risk aversion is like really useful, which we'll kind of get to in a second. And yeah, this is just waffle text really. But I think one thing I've noticed as you get older is it gets really easy to start assuming that you understand people. Like when you come to uni, and some of you would have experienced this, you meet a whole bunch of like weird people in a good way, right? Like I had this guy used to ride a unicycle around campus. I was like, why do you have a unicycle? It's kind of crazy. And he's like, well, you can't take a bicycle on a bus or a tram or something like that, but I can take a unicycle on a bus or a tram. And I was like, oh, okay. You're interesting. And you kind of go through uni, and I think very quickly in your mid-20s, you can start to feel like you've met everyone, so to speak. You know that feeling, you meet someone and you start being like, oh, that's a lot like so-and-so and so-and-so. And that's still true. That's a really important way to communicate. But I think it is always important to remember that quite literally everyone is always very unique. And particularly as well as you get into the workforce later, you will start to think that most people are the same, but that's because work has a really good way of making everyone feel the same, because everyone's trying to fit in, everyone's trying to be similar, but you don't know what family things people have going on. You don't know if people have been divorced. You don't know if people have childhood trauma. You don't know if they've come from a different background. Maybe they used to be like a flight attendant. Maybe they used to work in the kitchen. Like, you don't know. So asking questions is also just a great way to learn about a lot of this. Do any of you have any questions so far? Wonderful. Okay, so some of the most immediate ways that I think some of this can be applied to leadership is we talk about people being different. We talk about them being different because of these dimensions, so to speak. And to jump to that bottom line there, when you work with other people, and this is true for groups, this is true for industry, you need to get into the mindset of, broadly, there's no such thing as a good or bad person. There's just different people. Now, I don't want to sound like a total, utopic person here. There are some bad people, right? Like, I work in a company, and there are definitely, at the end of the day, we have 8 engineers, and if someone said to me, we've run out of money, you only have to pick 4, I wouldn't be like, oh my God, they're all just so different. I'd be like, no, there's a couple I definitely want who are clearly, like, in an overall sense, like, outperforming. So I'm not trying to gloss over the reality that there's, of course, always some just general differences in competencies and ease of work with people. But often you will find that you will possibly relegate people who you think are bad, but they're just different. I got a few examples here just from my own experience. So back in SunSwift in 2015, we were trying to redesign a steering column. So you got in a car, you got a steering wheel that you hold. There's kind of behind the steering wheel is a pole. That pole goes all the way down to a rack at the front of the car, which like turns the wheels, right? If you don't know what a steering rack is, you can Google it. If you don't care, then I guess you don't care. But we had some engineers working on this, and we kind of got this guy called Gabriel working on it, and he was such a good worker, like focused, got in, did it, built it, prototyped it, but it kept breaking, and he kept doing stupid stuff. Like, I remember we took the car out to a track one day, and Gabe, someone was in the car, and someone turned a corner, and the steering wheel just like snapped. Like steering wheels got some resistance, just like snapped, like it's like free to move. And we had a look, and he'd like used hard foam for the steering column, like foam. And we were just like, Gabe, what is like wrong with you? And he's like, well, we didn't have any other parts, and we said we had to get it done today. So like we did that, we weren't driving very fast. It was fine. It was just stupid. And so we kind of eventually moved him on to something else because something else came up. And then we got another person called Liz on it. And Liz was like the total opposite. Liz was like, super smart, super intellectual, real problem solver, thought through everything. But, no matter how much we tried to get stuff done, like weeks would always pass, right? She'd always need more time to get it right. This wasn't quite right. And, in the end, what we ended up doing with them both was we were like, let's just mix fire and water and see what happens. And we kind of shoved them both in a room, and we were like, well, you have a week to get it sorted. And they came out and did it in the end, right? And you'll find this a lot in your experiences, is that, most people are really good at stuff, but no one's really good at everything, and usually any tendency you have that makes you excel will create an equal and opposite thing, an area where you don't excel, So a good example is, again, a lot of environments I've been in are a lot of like divide and conquer environments where it's like, I'm like 3 people, we got 3 things to do, let's go away and do them and then come back, right? Whereas there are other places where it's like, let's all sit down and come together and like figure out what we want to do all 3. And so there's certain tendencies I have that wouldn't be good in certain scenarios too. The other one is, even in my own company, we see the same tendency. Just this is kind of a heads up. For engineers in general, you will often notice that people fall on a spectrum of like thoroughness but slowness, and speed but chaos. Occasionally you'll find some kind of golden goose that just like is perfect, and they're valuable, and love them and pay them is one piece of advice I'd have. But generally people fall on that spectrum. So then it's like, okay, they're not bad. We don't want to fire them. We don't want to get rid of them. But it's like, how can we channel and utilize these people as best as possible? So, if someone's really slow and thorough, give them the thing that you can't screw up. Give them the 2-factor authentication setup you have to do, or that's probably an example I can think of right now. The thing that you just can't mess up. Like we're a fintech at Pearl, the company I run. We deal with people's money. We manage about $700 million of people's money, right? It's like a lot of money. You don't want to screw that up. But then it's like you don't want to give those people, the slow and thorough ones, the work that needs to get done quickly. You want to do a lot of experimentation, a lot of prototyping, right? I have an idea, let's get to it, let's do it today. They won't do it today. They'll come back to you tomorrow with more questions. Some of those questions aren't relevant to get started. They'll get lost in it. So, you give that to people who are much more excitable and move easier, for instance, right? And then similar kind of thing happened in RoboCup too. RoboCup was a team of 9, and we had, a couple of second and third years, and we also had a couple of PhD students, right? The PhDs were difficult to get to move quickly because, it's their life. They're deep researchers. They really need to think about a problem. So same kind of thing in RoboCup. We had some really complicated, narrow problems to solve, like maybe a vision problem where we need to identify a ball, and we would give that to a certain person. And these are all the same story in a lot of ways, which is basically that, don't, as much as possible, don't look at someone and be like, you're crap. Be like, what are you good at and what are you not good at, right? And of course, in reality, we all want to aspire to be as good as many things as we can. We don't all just want to be like, I'm good at A, but not B, C, and D, because, in the workforce, it's like, at the end of the day, a company can't just get anyone doing anything. Quite often, there's more focused things. But point is, people are different. Use them effectively. Don't judge them. This is also true. Looping back, some of the stuff we talked about the person and competency and personality is really important when you're recruiting. When you're working in teams and you're getting to know people, it's really important to understand who they are as a person, their values and their personality, their temperament, their just general tendencies, not just their competence. Like even today, like when I interview software engineers, for instance, I won't spend a lot of time asking them about programming because I'm just going to assume they can program, right? If they can't program and they bamboozle me, well, you can fire them early on in Australia. You can fire someone really early on in Australia, usually like without any issue, right? So you don't have to be too worried about that. But it's like, it's always questions like, why are you doing this? How did you hear about us as a company? What motivates you? What kind of people do you want to work around? How have you interacted with other people in the past? What matters to you with people that you work with? You could kind of go on like with a long list of these questions, like, what's going on in your life right now? Like not in a weird personal way, but in like a weird, like, where do you live? Like, what do you do for fun? And you can start isolating people that might fit into your particular culture or interest. Maybe you'll realize some people just really love their work. Maybe you realize some people are massive learners. Some people just want to build good teams. Some people want to build high performing teams, etc. But that personal element of who someone is super important. Yes. That's a good question. And I like the question because you get into vicious cycles with this is the problem, right? And I have this too. It's like, okay, you've got this really important work. Who are you going to give it to? You're going to give it to the highest performer because the highest performer will get it done and you need it done. You can't mess about. It's like, okay, now the highest performer is a higher performer. And the person who's the lowest performer just ended up fixing more bugs. The short answer, which is annoying, is like you just kind of have to find a balance of like how can you reduce the problem down? So it's like, okay, maybe you got some stuff to do with GraphQL. It's like, well, can I create the tiniest problem for them? Like I just want you to do the narrowest, simplest thing, and then you start there, and you can kind of build them out. Everyone reaches their limit eventually, and some people just have a learning limit or a competency limit. But I'd say just breaking into smaller problems. Pretty much everything that's too much for people, there's always like a first step. Or an easier thing. It's just kind of digging out. Like sometimes one of the biggest challenges there is just the right kind of task setting. Like if you get a good set of, you do task setting properly, I think you can kind of get on the way with that. That helps. Yeah, definitely. Understanding the people's massive. Like, there are some people too who don't like open-ended problems. It stresses them out. And some people love it because they feel like they got some space. Some people hate when you're like, here's the problem, here's the article to read, here's what to do. They're like, I'm not a monkey. Whereas other people love that because they're like, I'm not feeling very confident, I'm quite anxious, and it's a good starting point. So yeah, definitely an individual element to that. Cool. The last thing on the applying to leadership front, this is more a footnote, which is just, we talked about understanding people, but one thing I've also seen and learned over the years is like, there's a common misconception I find where people are like, oh, okay, someone is trying to lead a group, that there must be some rules about leading groups. That's like, you know, you're meant to be confident or just whatever. But at the end of the day, all I've learned is that when you're interacting with a group, you should view that as an aggregate of a series of underlying personal connections, right? So everything is always an individual relationship. If you work, you know, if you've got a partner, that's an individual relationship. If you're running a team of 20, that's 20 individual relationships that just happen to be at the same time. So it's like, you need to invest in general. And this is true even if you're not like in some kind of authority or leadership scenarios, even if you're just working with 20 people, because any time you work together, you're inherently a leader in your own way, right? Not everyone's a monkey. But it's like, you know, take the time to ask them about their lives, you know, like, do you have any pets? What are you up to? Obviously, this takes some learning in the workplace in general, right? Like, you know what it's like. Let's say you're looking at like a stereotypical, you know, where most but not all people in the workplace are like heterosexual. It's like, okay, now you're a male, and you're like, oh, I'll ask like my female, you know, colleague or whatever, like, what do you get up to on the weekend? And they're going to be like, I'm under attack, and you're going to get, you know, in trouble for that kind of thing. So there's like a lot of like more interpersonal learning involved in terms of like how to build this and how to figure out how do I get to know people I work with without pushing any personal boundaries. I don't want to ask about, you know, their family, be like, did anything rough happen to you in childhood? That's not what you ask. But the point is that like people you work with, and this is the same for my employees, it's like you should always generally know, you know, what makes them happy, what are their hobbies. If they have pets, you know, ask them once a week how their pet's going. Do you have any cute photos of your dog, right? You ask someone you work with that like has a dog to like show you a cute photo of their dog, and you say something nice about it, not in an insincere psychotic way, in like a genuine way. Like immediately now, if you do that at scale across a dozen people, when you are interacting with them as a group, you know that those personal relationships are what invokes the respect, right? It's not your role, it's those underlying parts there. So we're getting on to a few pieces of motivation. Who's seen this before? It kind of gets thrown around. I've seen it a bunch in my life. At various points, I'll like pay attention and not pay attention. It's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's essentially a pyramid that says this is the most important stuff to people, and this is less important, and this is less important, and this is less important. And if you work through it, it's like the top one, self-actualization, is like, I mean, I'll read this straight off the side. It's like the desire to become the most of what one can be. We all have these like internal aspirations, like I want to be smart, I want to be kind, I want to be like a good father, I want to be a good mother, I want to be a good sibling, etc. There's like esteem, which is like, you know, I want respect, recognition, and all of that. Love and belonging, we want to belong to a community, like personal safety, employment, you know, that kind of security. And then physiological needs, like air, water, food, and shelter. Now, I don't want to, you know, we're not doing a psych course, and I'm sure I'd say a lot wrong here, but the main thing that I think this demonstrates for me is like what motivates people, what's important to people starts right in the center of them, and then it echoes outwards from there, right? It's like, okay, how I am and how I view myself is most important. And then it's like how the people around me view that. And then it's like how comfortable I am in the world is important surrounding that. And we're going to come back to that as well. Also want to talk about expectance theory, which again, thank you, Nick, for the literature here, which is basically a theory that said, and this is pretty straightforward. This is one of those things like when someone's like the rule of conservation of energy. Like, well, that makes sense. Probably could have guessed that. It's like, so this is the emphasis that, you know, rewards are correlated to performance. Right. So if people have something to work towards, if they have a goal that's set, if they have something they get at the end of the tunnel, they're more likely to actually achieve and perform towards the end of that. These are all just pretexts for a broader point. And this is interesting because it can change the way how we work with individuals and motivate them, right? So this whole thing being about motivation. Now, if anyone's, do you guys have a pet? Everyone? Okay. So you know what it's like you want to, you know, if anyone's ever had a pet or a dog, it's like you want to motivate them to exhibit good behavior and like perform well, right? So it's like, okay, they sit, so you feed them. Great. That's the obvious case. And then it's like, if they do something bad, you kind of want to pressure them and put stress on them so they don't do it. But you don't want to do it in an awful way either, right? That's when you get into the whole like positive teaching of pets, where it's like you never do anything negative. But what I'd say is there's a bunch of things you can do, back to that reward-driven thing, that are like just, you know, setting targets for people to work towards. And then there's a few ways where it's like you can create pressure, but not in a kind of mean way. You never ever want to be, you never want to make people feel small in general. That like never works. So there are some times where like, you know, a firmer hand is useful, where you kind of put pressure on people, you kind of put a little bit of stress on them, but in a way that's like, you know, we can do this. I mean, has anyone ever played sport, you know, and it's like you're down a couple of points and you got to win, and someone's like, this is serious now, no, you know, no effing about, let's go. And it's like, you don't feel this like sadness in you, feel like this like, okay, it's scary, but like we got to do this kind of thing, right? Like that's the tone you're essentially trying to get through. Because I think some of the you always just want to be positive is really tough. I think it's more like pressure's okay, it just needs to be done in a healthy, encouraging way, you know. And some examples of helping motivate people through, you know, rewards or other incentives are like promotions are obvious. I talk to a lot of people about, you know, maybe you see someone who's not performing right or the best, so you say, well, hey, well, what are you looking for? You talk to them, and you know, you're like, well, do you want a higher role or a more important role or more responsibility? Or you get into compensation. You know, you have equity plans or bonuses, things that motivate people beyond the moment, right? So in a workplace, there's a reason that people don't just give you salaries, because the salary feels consistent. There's no reason you should work harder today or tomorrow because you're still going to get paid, and it's kind of hard to get rid of you. But you know, a lot of companies will offer employees equity. So then every day they're like, well, I want this company to succeed because then I'll get more financial outcomes. So therefore I should work harder and I should care about what other people are doing. And then a lot of companies will have these kind of bonus systems where it's like, if the company achieves its goal, then everyone gets more money this year for Christmas. Okay, great. This just establishes rewards. Yep. That's a good question. So I don't know if that got caught, but the question was like, can these kinds of things ever create bad vibes, right? Where it's like, okay, if we achieve our 50% growth target, then everyone gets a $10,000 bonus in the company, or a 10% bonus, or whatever it is. And it's like, then you see some people being lazy and you're like, freaking Luke doesn't do any work, I'm not going to get my bonus because of that. I think that sometimes is the short answer. I think maybe a little less at big companies, I find, because big companies have this like, people often feel out of control anyway. They feel like their actions aren't going to shift anything, and therefore, you know, Luke not working is not going to like change anything. I think it's smaller companies, definitely. I think another thing too is that you got to be careful with some types of rewards like this, where, you know, take our company Perla, how much people spend is like, we're quite heavily correlated to general macroeconomics. So right now people spend less. So it's like, if we were to put an unrealistic target on there and then everyone worked really hard and did all the right things, but the numbers didn't look good, everyone's just going to feel depressed because they feel like they did everything they should, but nothing kind of came from it, right? So then it's like, should you not give incentives? Should you be more careful about incentives? You know, should you find incentives towards things that are less mutable by things we can't control? Yep.
How do you find kind of tricky? How do you find partners being environmental when investing for one measure and it results very well known that metric actual was the people for
Yeah, that's a good question. How do you make people motivate them for rewards that aren't just some random nuanced reward? Like, I would say that there are probably layers to it, you know, like back to the, and I think I mentioned this somewhere, maybe it's here. I think it's in the next one. I don't know where it is. Let me see. Yeah, it's there. Um, I'm going to jump to this for a second because I think this kind of addresses it. It links back to the Maslow's hierarchy stuff, which is like, so quick tangent, I'll come back to that. Is like, when I was running SunSwift, we used to have this problem that I hated, which was we'd have team meetings with 50 people. And if anyone's ever tried to get 30 people anywhere on time, it's really annoying, right? It's like nightmarish. And then it's like, well, you don't want to start without people there, because then people start not coming on time because they know they can not come on time, right? But you don't want to be a monster either, because then people don't like you and they don't trust you. So, you know, there are all these different things I tried, and what was interesting was that it kind of came back, funnily enough, same to the hierarchy, where it's like the lowest order form of way you can motivate someone is something external. Basically, challenge their security. Be like, if you don't turn up on time, I'm going to be unhappy with you. Which is basically another way of saying, like, the security of your position is a jeopardy, right? A slightly more, and you got to be careful with these. They can turn into becoming a psychopath pretty quick if you're not careful. But it's like the next one is like leveraging their peers, which is like, and here's an example of something you got to be careful with. It's like, okay, hey everyone in the team, we're not going to start until Nick is here, and if you don't like that, like, talk to Nick, right? Now that's an interesting one, because Nick's going to be far more motivated by his peers than he is going to be from authority, in a general sense, right? Different people are different, once again. But you know, you'd have to be careful with that one, because then you can seem like you're not doing your job, or that can seem like bullying too if you're not like careful, right? Yep. Yeah, we had that with soccer too. Yeah. Exactly. So, you know, and there is no easy answer besides you just got to do it right. Like, definitely there was some element, like I think about playing soccer as a kid, and they were like, if you ever, like, the coach was like, if you ever pick up the ball, you'll have to run around the oval. It was like a don't touch the ball kind of thing. And that was certainly motivating for me to not touch the ball, but that's also because it happened very infrequently, right? But you're right, if you're not careful, the team dynamic's not right, then suddenly everyone's just going to be hating each other, which isn't good. And then the most important thing you can do, or generally the highest, as we talk about that self-actualization element, is like talk to what someone wants to be themselves, right? So let's say someone did turn up late for a meeting, you know, and a few times. It's like you pull them over and you basically say, like, you know, like, what are you doing here? You know, like, what do you want? Like, tell me the type of person you want to be. Do you want to be someone that, you know, we can rely on? Like, again, not in a passive aggressive way. You know, get them to describe their ideal self, and they'll often say things like, you know, I want to be respected. I want to have responsibility. And then you can talk to them about, well, okay, to do that, we actually need you to now turn up on time. And that's always going to be the most powerful way to get people to do anything, because people will always do things for who they want to be as a person, right? So digging through that, sorry for the typo, digging through that towards inner, right? So security, peers, yourself is usually a pretty strong way to do it. So back to the question about, you know, companies have these stupid KPIs. Well, companies need KPIs, of course, but then you can go deeper in that and be like, well, you know, let's set some goals within the group and the organization. And then further to that, it's like back to the whole promotional element, or like, you know, what do you want to be as well? Because KPIs are often company-wide, but within teams, you can kind of create structures or support people. So that's probably what I'd say there, is figure out something a lot more personal to them. Because most KPI things get pretty broken anyway, because you just can't perfect them. So, you know, layer it would be the short answer. Did that answer the question? Cool. There were some pretty positive examples, like the promotions and compensation and stuff. Some more interesting ones about like putting people in more high pressure environments, but still in a supportive way. You know, we used to do a thing, again, these are some SunSwift stories, where we would say to someone, okay, we want you to learn this, we want you to understand this, become the domain expert on this. But what you do is you really motivate them by saying, at the end of this, you're going to have to, you know, stand up and explain it to people. You're going to have to go and present it to people. And again, when you get into these high pressure things, you have to be careful, because at some point it becomes anxiety inducing and bullying. But if it's done in the right way, it's motivating, particularly if you encourage someone, right? It's not like you're going to get up and do it, and if you screw it up, you're in trouble. It's like, you're going to get up and do it. I believe you can do it. I'm here to help you. Why don't we chat next Thursday about how it's going? You know, that's a whole different vibe. And similarly, like even in Perla, when it comes to our engineers, we noticed early on there was a few engineers who kept pushing a lot of bugs. You know, they'd make mistakes, no matter how much we test it or check it. So what we ended up doing was we kind of set up a triage system where if they were working on a particular feature and bugs came in through customer service through like a live messaging system, those would get triaged straight to the engineer, and they'd be responsible for working with the customer on solving that problem. So let's say they pushed something and then the page didn't load and the customer couldn't withdraw their money. We'd put them in the front line to work with that customer to solve the problem. And again, we were supportive about it. It's like, we're here to help you. Let us know if you need like us to review a message or something like this. But very quickly we helped. You know, the reward for them was to reduce that risk of having to talk to that customer, right? Because it's stressful. No one wants to talk to customers as a general rule. So again, there's some examples of some higher pressure scenarios that are worth thinking about. This is pretty much a copy and paste from the literature. It's probably the biggest slide we have here, but I love this kind of summary, which again, like goal theory proposes that setting specific and challenging goals is motivating, right? Funny that humans are goal oriented in general. And we know this, right? If I just say to you, I want you to stop eating chocolate because you'll lose weight, you just think, okay. But if I say to you, okay, we're going to, you know, if you do this and we're going to hit this goal in a week and that goal in 2 weeks and that goal in 4 weeks, you materialize it and it suddenly becomes real and achievable. But a few highlights from this, you know, goals increase performance. That's pretty intuitive. Difficult goals, when accepted by the team, increase it even more. That's quite interesting. People are really aspirational if you dig into them. If you figure out, you know, people really want to be the best they can be. Nearly everyone. It's very hard to find people who aren't like that. The real question is, you know, what is it that they want to be, and do they feel supported and motivated to become that? Because a lot of people can get very depressed, right? Just like feel completely not of worth. But if you can set a difficult goal with someone, motivate them to the point where they're on board, then you'll get even better outcomes. And similarly, if you set difficult goals where people aren't bought into it, you're probably going to get worse outcomes, right? Like back to the KPI example, people might just be like, this is stupid, I don't care. Feedback leads to higher performance. We're going to talk about that later. Self-generated feedback is more powerful. Yeah, that makes sense. Again, back to the self-actualization elements. People will feel more motivated when they give themselves feedback, generally because they'll listen to themselves, if you can get that kind of healthy feedback cycle. But we will talk about feedback in a bit, so I won't get into that too much. And this one I love. Participation in goal setting is valuable because people are more committed to choices in which they have a part. This is back to understanding people. And if you understand this part, life will get a lot better. It's really tempting to think of yourself, particularly in a leadership position, to kind of just tell people what to do. There are times where you need to do that, or where that's like, depending on the person and depending on the circumstance. But wherever possible, you should get people bought into the goal, right? So for instance, right now at Perla, we have about 15 initiatives that we're working on, and they all link back to some kind of high-level KPIs that drive our North Star goal. And what we're doing as part of that is saying, okay, everyone's in charge of these different initiatives. We've got these tasks for everyone next week where they're going to go and come back with a one-line summary of what they're working on. They're going to come back with 1 or 2 measures, like things to track, like graphs that link back to the KPIs, and they're going to come up with a start date and end date, right? Now, at the end of the day, who probably like decides on that and finalizes that is not them. They'll work with someone, but by getting them bought into that early on, they start to feel like they own it. It's a pretty straightforward principle, right? People that own things feel more motivated to do it. It gets more complicated sometimes if you work with people who are just difficult. That's where you tend to drive yourself into not letting them own things. You know, there are people I've worked with where every time you give them an opportunity to own something, they just send it on a wild tangent, and all you end up doing is basically correcting them or course correcting them. And that gets into a tricky territory where it's like, you don't want to give people freedom to express themselves if all you're going to do is shut them down. Because then you demotivate them probably even more than just telling them what to do at the end of the day. But that's in a whole other bucket of like, you know, managing people, which is interesting. And then last point on this, which I don't see a lot floating around, is that I think that sometimes there's an overemphasis in particularly modern workplaces you kind of get this whole like open workplace, sharing everything, everyone has a voice, and that's like super important. I want to be clear, I'm not disputing that. But where you got to be careful is that if you don't create boundaries within an environment for people, they won't feel like they can express themselves and they have the freedom to basically, you know, be themselves. So a good example is like, you know, let's say again, I put Nick in charge of something. It's like, well, Nick should feel like he can do that without everyone being able to critique it all the time or be able to interject and cause a ruckus, because then Nick just gets scared. And you kind of see this as well when you have, say, you know, massive chats, like massive group chats, and you're like, everyone's just all going to chat in this massive open space. People get scared because they know if they say something, there's going to be a lot of people critiquing them, for instance, right? So there's like a bit of a balance here, I think, between you want to create really open, transparent environments, but not so much so that people don't feel like they have their little avenue to, express themselves in, which is really important. Okay, so we've got a couple of sections left, just a couple things on resolving conflict and then some high pressure environments, then we're pretty much at the end. So a couple of questions here, there's only two. What do you do when you get into a disagreement with someone? This is pretty common. Who's ever had a disagreement with someone in their life? Yeah, good, you're human. The best way I think that you can conceptualize this, and this comes back to understanding individuals, is that you'll find that 90% is just a number. It's probably more than that. Most of the time, when you disagree with someone, it's just because you're not speaking the same language, right? And this comes from a whole bunch of things. We think back to that personal element, that situational element. This happens a lot with, say, my employees, where, I'll be like, we really want to get this feature out today, and they'll be like, oh, I don't think that's a good idea. We've got too many, it's not ready yet. It's going to be bad. I don't want to do it. And you can very quickly get into a spire of words where you think you're fighting about whether this feature should come out. But what's really happening is, I'm operating under a slightly different context where, I've got pressure from the CEO who has this investor that he's meeting tomorrow. And that investor's maybe not going to care about how perfect everything is, but they want to be inspired by it. So instead of arguing about whether it should go out or not, always take the time to remove that immediate conflict and start just talking nothing but context. It's like, tell me more about why you're, feeling that way, why you're talking that way. What are you scared about? What are you worried about? Like, describe it to me. And you can describe it to them too. And you'll often find nearly all the time, the conversations always end up, right, with like, oh, okay, I understand. Actually, that makes more sense now. And that goes in both ways. That goes in the way of like you understanding, say, them and them understanding you, right? So that's super important. That's one of the probably the main things, if anything, I could leave you all with today is just focus on trying to bring context together. Most smart people will agree if they're on the same page, right? Doesn't always work, but it's pretty strong. And then the second one, and this is, I'm trying to throw some counter examples here, which is like, what happens when two people fight? And, I'm not a parent, which is, I hear mixed stories about whether I'm lucky or unlucky at this point in time. But, I feel like what happens is everyone eventually goes through a point in their life where you kind of start off thinking about working with people and motivating people and understanding people, where all you want to do is make them feel good and happy all the time. But you will eventually run into situations where two things are at a complete conflict and you simply can't be a positive force everywhere all the time in a totally complete way. And a really good example, again, back to the SunSwift solar car stories, is we would have a mechanical team who'd be working on the car. We'd have a Saturday event, big, massive event. It's super important. We'd have people working on the car all week. They'd be preparing the doors and the steering and the wheels. And then the electrical team would kind of like mostly be there, but they'd kind of be half checked out. And then they turn up, Friday night and they work all night. And they weren't spending the time during the week. And then the car can't even drive on the Saturday. So it's like, okay, now you've got a problem where it's like the electrical team is feeling stressed that they've maybe done something wrong and not worked hard. And the mechanical team's really sad that they put in all this effort, which you motivated them to do, and it was all for nothing. So, you got these mechanical people who are looking to you to essentially establish order, and you've got these electrical people who are looking for you to not put too much pressure on them, right? Because obviously no one likes pressure on them. And in a scenario like that, I'm not like, we could talk about it for a long time, but the point is that there's no arena there where you're going to have everyone be thrilled with you at the end of that day, right? You're either going to have to kind of like tell the mechanical people that like the electrical people did their best and like we'll see how it goes, and they're just going to be like, why did I believe you in the first place? Like, why did I follow this? Like, I feel like that's a very wet answer. Or on the flip side, it's like if you talk to the electrical people and you're like, you really need to step up because like this really impacted a lot of people, and I'm not convinced this is the type of people you want to be. They're going to feel a little bit, uncertain of you. Maybe they won't feel negative, but maybe they'll feel a little bit scared. Like it's always going to have some non-positive temporal change in the interaction. So I think that's just an important note to make. And I mentioned the parenting thing before because I see this happen with parents all the time. Like one kid punches the other kid in the face. Like someone's not going to have a positive interaction with you after that, right? And that's just kind of part of it. And then your job is to make it as positive as possible, but not everything can be totally positive. Okay, so really quickly here, there's a few examples I want to give around high pressure environments. My work in, web tech, And the teaching stuff is like, you call it like a fairly low pressure environment in the sense that, no one's going to die really. And on the flip side, then I've got like the high pressure ones, which are like the solar car stuff, where it's like you're driving an experimental car around the country, and if something goes wrong, the car crashes and like 3 20-year-olds die, right? And this is important because they're very different a lot of the time. And like a really good example is that I learned that in higher pressure environments, particularly things that are life or death, or particularly things that have essentially like one opportunity to get it right, for instance, like a demo day, maybe you're building like, paper planes or something, and there's like a competition every 2 years. It's really important to focus on getting the job done, sometimes at the expense of short-term friction. I think this is less so when you're working in like a more calm workplace. Like when you're working in, say again, like web tech, right? We're all software engineers working at home. A lot of the focus is on trying to remove any friction or tension in the team, because that's when people work the best together, right? Sometimes if someone does something bad, you don't want to kind of step on their toes and scare them, or course correct too quickly, because that might create resentment and a few other things. But the good example for me was that we did 2 races in 2015 and 2017 that I ran. And in 2015, we finished the race and we came like 3rd or something. In 2017, the car failed about 800 kilometers from Darwin, and we had to pull out of the race, right? And what was interesting was that my approach in 2017 was very different, because I was starting to get more risk averse in terms of creating issues within the team, and I started to see some problems with how some of the engineering was done, and like culturally how people were focusing, and I was like pushing them, but they were resisting me, and I felt like I was kind of losing the positive connection I had with them. And that essentially led to a scenario where there were a lot of problems with the car, and the suspension collapsed on the highway basically, and like we nearly killed someone and we didn't, and then we had to pull out. And it's like, what's interesting is when I then look back at those scenarios, the 2017 example, everyone kind of hates each other, to be dramatic, right? Because it was a horrible experience where everything was about this one moment, and the moment went to hell. So it doesn't matter how supportive and nice and all this other stuff you were in the lead up, no one got where they wanted to go at the end of the day. And obviously they have some positive memories, but the point is when you go to the 2015 one, which was a much kind of harder environment where we'd have a culture. It's like if someone was doing something unsafe, it was like you would tell them directly. Like you wouldn't, and I don't know if you had this experience with the army, for instance, like you just, it was like no messing about, right? This is serious. And we did that race well. And again, positive memories, a lot of good culture from that, because at the end of the day, that's what people remember. We all set out on a goal. There was some tricky bits throughout the middle, but we got there in the end. On the other side, we had a good time in the middle and we didn't get there in the end. That's a really tidbit. Most of you won't really come into that kind of situation, but worth talking about. Oh yeah, I guess a couple of quick fun things. I'll probably skip through the feedback element because I feel like that's pretty self-explanatory. But another fun thing I like to do in high pressure environments, because here's the problem with high pressure environments. People generally get stressed, and when people get stressed, they get aggressive or rude to other people, right? So let's say has anyone ever done something like go camping or go traveling and you're sleep deprived and you haven't showered and everyone just starts yelling at each other? It's like one of the best things you can do is try and figure out ways how to keep everyone's ego down, right? So if you can keep people's ego down and their self-worth like at a reasonable level most of the time, then generally people treat each other with respect. And like one way we did this was that when we were training the solar car, again, these are all solar car examples, when we were doing training events where we go away for 3 days, we would give people roles that they were terrible at. So we give the person who always got lost, they put them in charge of navigation. We'd give that rich kid from overseas who'd never made a meal in his life to look after the food, and it was complete chaos throughout this entire training thing. But what was great about it was that everyone essentially kind of came away from it very humbled from the experience and being like, okay, actually there's a lot of stuff here that's really hard, and people couldn't isolate themselves in their little vacuums where their sole responsibility was to manage an electrical component, where they were really good at that, and everyone else was just screwing them up because they burnt the rice. I wish they could do their job like I can do my job. So that was fun. And then you get a lot of like common adversity. This is kind of more true outside of high pressure environments anyway. Like, I mean, the other thing's true outside of it too, kind of good general advice, but common adversity is a great one. That's what team building is, like that kind of classic cliche you see where people are like, we're all going to go build a raft together and try and get across the river or something like that. Our equivalent one was that we would drive across the desert and we realized that for the last 10 years, we'd never had a wet weather plan ever. And it's just because it doesn't rain in the desert. And it did rain that year, that we had a wet weather plan, and we thought it'd be fun to we were like, how do you sleep 30 people in the desert? with something that you can package in the back of a car. And we thought, well, we bought a 10 meter by 10 meter tarp and like 30 poles. And then all we did every Saturday was we got 10 people together and we kept doing a little competition to see if we could like set up the tarp as quickly as possible. So it's like how quickly can you get all the poles up? And if anyone's ever tried to set up something like this, it is an absolute nightmare. It's like really difficult, requires a lot of coordination. Someone pulls and then something falls and then something else falls. And that was, again, great from a team building perspective because you're helping everyone be like, okay, this is hard. I make mistakes, therefore I get it when other people make mistakes. It's 1 o'clock. I want to be on time, but the one slide I'll leave you with here is we talked before about feedback being important. Even if you have good relationships with people, it's good to develop good feedback processes because not everyone in every organization, in every environment situation will talk to you openly. And sometimes you just need good systematic structures to talk about feedback so you can understand each other. These are examples of feedback we did with our employees recently. Top questions they answered, bottom questions we answered. I know that's super fine print, but they kind of are pretty open-ended. And as long as it's positive, things are pretty good. I think that, yeah, blank slide, and thank you for Luke and Joshua and I don't remember your names, I'm sorry. Twice, I know. Rohan. You're sad. Okay. William. Okay, cool. Okay. Thank you, Rohan, William, Luke, and Joshua. Cool.
Thank you very much, Hayden. We'll take a 10-minute break and then we've got Nick, who's an engineering manager at Atlassian, talking about culture next.